We're going to spend a couple of weeks talking about these first few chapters of Exodus because there's a lot in here, and in particular, one of the things that we're going to start to see emerge in the opening chapters, thank you, is this connection to Adonai, to Yahweh, in a very different way than we have before. We have to really unpack what's going on in the story. So, hopefully everyone had a chance to read the first 5 or 6 chapters. We're going to review them a couple of times because I want you to understand both the traditional and the critical approaches. And because they're so jam-packed with material, it's worth going through them again because I'm hoping that you'll see even more from what you saw as you read it. And then we're going to start to unpack the critical stuff. So even if you looked at the different colors in the books, put it aside for a moment and let's try to suspend our beliefs for a little bit so that we can really get what is at the heart of the story. So, who can someone summarize for me what happens in chapter 1 of Exodus? I'm on page 317 in the Chumash. For those of you who have it in the English, I'm on page
119.
Thank you. 119.
317. I guess it's the first.
What happens when we begin the book of Shemot?
Genesis or Exodus?
Exodus. So first of all, before we even do that, what happens at the end of Genesis? Where is the scene at the end of Genesis? Joseph dies. Jacob dies. Where are they? They're in Egypt. Why are they in Egypt? There was a famine, right? Jacob and his sons all experience famine in the land of Canaan. They go down to Egypt because they want to get food. Who's in charge of Egypt at the time? Pharaoh is number 1, but who's number 2? Joseph. And what is Joseph's responsibility? He's essentially the Secretary of Agriculture, if you will. And it's his responsibility over the first 7 years of plenty to gather up all of the excess food and to store it away so that during the 7 years of famine, he can give it out to people. And the way that the story ends is Joseph is on top. Right? You got Pharaoh, but we don't really know so much about Pharaoh at the time. But we have Joseph, and Joseph is number 2. He is the premier, the vizier, whatever you want to call it. And so the book of Exodus starts first and foremost with what?
The new king arose.
Before the new king arises. Yes, there is a recap of the story.
Story of lots of generations.
We get all of the generations. It starts with the Elish Shmot B'nai Israel. These are the names of all of the children of Israel who came down into Egypt. And it goes through all 12 of the tribes. Why would we want to know from the outset that the beginning of the book of Exodus starts with a recap of these 12 tribes? Why is that important?
Connected.
Good, so there's a level of connectivity. What else?
Sort of like everyone is there.
Everyone was there. You might have thought that perhaps some of the Israelites were left behind, but no, the entire Israelite people, all of Jacob and his sons and his descendants and the future tribes, they're all in Egypt. Okay, and then take a look at verse 6. I'm on page 318. It is worth noting, I'm also on page, for those of you who want page 119, verse 6. It is worth noting that when they go down to Egypt initially that there's only 70 people.
That's
Okay?
everyone.
That's the whole mishpacha. It's a big family reunion. Why do we care about the number 70? Why is it important? 70 is going to become the basis for numbers like the Sanhedrin, which we think there were 70 or 72 elders that were part of the Great Assembly. But it also is an important number to know because it's small. One of the things we're going to learn very quickly in the story is how quickly the Israelites multiply.
They're kind of like Indians.
Okay, I'll leave that between the two of you.
You know, that's some racist shit.
Racist.
Phil, let me just remind you that you're on YouTube.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Okay, you'll edit that
I
one.
might have to edit that.
Okay. Now, verse 6 is important because we start to see the shift in the story away from Joseph. Verse 6 says, Joseph died. Joseph died and all his brothers and all of that generation. Why do we need to know this?
What's the end point?
Say more.
What's the end point? Then we're going to have a new beginning.
Good. So presumably the end of Joseph's generation, it's over, and now we're going to start something new. And then it says in verse 7, but the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so the land was filled with them. Why do we need to know that?
Well, it's a promise also that you be fruitful and multiply.
Good. So you might think when you're reading the beginning of Exodus that the promise that was conveyed to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob is being fulfilled. They are being prolific and they're multiplying even though Joseph is no longer in the picture. Jerry?
It's also indicating that they're becoming a threat there in Egypt.
Good.
That's, yeah.
Good.
Right, that is.
They're growing so much that we might think that they're going to have some impact on the dynamic between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Who is Joseph, by the way? Which one is he, Israelite or Egyptian?
Both.
Both.
That's a Jewish answer, both. Okay, tell me why he's Israelite. Why is Joseph Israelite?
He's heritage.
Say more. Who's his father? Jacob is his father. Okay? But why is he Egyptian?
Because he adopted, he assimilated
Yes.
into Egypt's society.
How does he assimilate?
He cut his hair, he shaved, he wore Egyptian dress, he speaks, and he gets an Egyptian name.
He gets an Egyptian
and
name, he gets an
wife.
Egyptian wife who happens to be a priestess, all kinds of different things, Jerry.
But at the end of the day, he decided he was still only an
Good.
Israelite.
At the end of the day, he still decides to be an Israelite. He still chooses his connection back to his father, and he welcomes him down into Egypt. But at the very least, they're still doing pretty well in terms of multiplying. Yep, Sam?
So I'm wondering if this verse 7 is slightly pejorative, in that it seems, it's almost like you would describe locusts or
That's a little later.
I understand, but
Yes.
when I read this, I see a certain negative cast to it.
Yep. So what is the pejorative nature of it? Like what is the negativity that you might read?
That we're less than human, we're animals almost.
Okay. What else?
So the translations are different.
I was just gonna say the same thing.
All right.
So
So let's
read
look
the
at
Hebrew.
Friedman for a second.
Yeah.
How does Friedman translate verse 7? Rebrew?
And the children of Israel were fruitful and teemed and multiplied and became very, very powerful, and the land was filled with them.
Okay.
Yes.
Which sounds a little bit like insects,
Right.
bugs,
Vermin.
vermin, all over the place. The Hebrew says the following, Uvenei Yisrael, paru vayishritzu vayirbu vaya'atzmu bim'od be'od. There are 4 different verbs to describe how multiplied they become. Pru or vu is usually the one that we associate with being fruitful and multiply. It's the first commandment in the Torah. When Adam and Eve are put on the earth, they're told that they're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. Pru or vu. But this one includes in it vayishritzu, which is actually a word. A sheretz is a creepy crawly thing.
Like bugs or mice.
Yes. And the creepy crawly things that crawl on the ground are called shratzim.
True.
Yeah, you're right. Vayirbu means they became rabbah. They became great. And not just bima'od, but bima'od me'od. Right? 2 me'ods. Very, very. So you're right, Stan. Good. The language tells us that there's something unbelievable happening with how fast they're growing. So much so that it feels like they are overpowering us, that they're attacking us. Good.
It sounds alliterative when you read it.
It is. Yeah, it's definitely alliterative, and not only that, the last 3 words says "Vatimaleh haaretz otam." The land was filled with them. We're not going to talk about who wrote it yet, but the authorship actually is important.
That one is, yeah. it's
Okay,
different.
just look at the color of verse 7 for a second in your other book, page 119. What color is it? It's in what authorship? Why would the priests want to emphasize the growing nature of the people?
The fulfillment of
It's the
prophecy.
fulfillment of the covenant.
Covenant.
More than the prophecy, it's the fulfillment of the covenant. If you did not know that this was written by another author, you might just think, what? We grew from 70 to a lot.
Right.
But when you understand the authorship, you may say, well, maybe there was a perspective that the author wants to convey in the writing. But don't worry about that for now, we'll come back to it.
When the priests get more wealthy?
Totally. Not only would they get more wealthy, they get more power.
Right.
Right? This is a power play. Okay, now, verse 8 is very important. Vayakom melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Why is this verse important? Sarah?
Well, it sets up the dynamic of not being indebted to the Israelites and the Hebrews, but it cuts off the history.
Good.
And it makes them just a threat and not
Good.
something else.
What's the historical connection that you think might be important to connect Joseph to?
That he saved the
Joseph was the savior. He was the guy who made everything okay. He came up with the great policy. He interpreted the dreams. He saved everyone from famine. But this new king doesn't know Joseph. And by the way, if you go back just a second to verse 6, who else does the king not know?
The rest of them.
Anyone from the generation.
The Israelites.
He doesn't know the Israelites. And now all of a sudden he's got these leeches, these roaches that are all of a sudden, they're everywhere. I can't escape them. Yeah.
First of all, I was going to say, I was going to do my best not to speak up here because I wanted to kind of meet the people, but I can't resist.
Go ahead.
We're
This is Gary. Gary, this is everyone. Some of you know Alana Zismore, who leads High Holiday Services.
Yeah.
This is her dad.
Oh,
yes,
yes.
So welcome to Gary. And Phyllis also is in the area, but not here.
So anyway, you see, we're sort of focusing on kind of understanding the literal progression of the development of this story.
Right.
But I've always been fascinated by the question, who left Egypt and why is the story so important?
Great.
And you have to understand history in terms of the politics, societies, in terms of their politics. So a lot of people who were in favor with the ruling person, the ruling class, suddenly fell out of favor with the ruling class. And there's the fact that there's a lot means that maybe there are different groupings, but they need to have a common story.
Right.
And I wonder, I think this is like the central story of Judaism.
Yep.
And it's a way that we can all feel a connection with being a Jew. If you're a Midianite and you decide to join the Jews, you have a story. If you come from different communities in Egypt, you have a common story. But what's really happening here? I think there is this political event that happened, and this is the story that we create 500 years later or 1,000 years later to say, why are we all Jews?
Right. And I think you're right. I think that's one of the reasons why this is the seminal story in our relationship with God. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's so much of it comes out of a result of a change in power dynamic. And it's probably one of the reasons why the politics are influencing it. I mean, we're going to look at the whole political system that changes the whole dynamic. Right? We're looking at it from the Torah right now. We're going to look at it from the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom in a couple of weeks. Rico?
Yeah, just building on that, I think it also goes back to, based on what you gleaned from your handout last time, who's writing and when he's writing, and this is the same thing when the kingdom splits. There's a large part that is kind of, and now they feel like they have to assert themselves back into the story.
Good.
In a way to establish credibility.
Right.
They're credible.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm going to intentionally not do right now is I'm not going to look into the political piece or who wrote it yet. I really want to make sure you understand this story, right? Phil would probably make the argument that chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 of Exodus are the most pivotal parts of the story in terms of coming into relationship with Adonai, right? But I don't want to go there just yet because if we don't understand what's happening here, we'll think about it this way. This is a really great introduction to Passover, so I'm giving you several months of material in advance. Yeah?
The Egyptians, did they have written history at this point?
Totally.
So it is possible for this pharaoh to know exactly what happened. And
Yes.
so it's not that he doesn't literally know or he couldn't know, but he either chooses it, or what they're getting at is, there was no personal relationship anymore.
Could be that there's no
He
personal
doesn't know
relationship.
any Jews anymore.
Right. There's a debate to be had about whether or not the Bnei Israel, the Israelites, are even the people in question. Or if it's a different group of people that we could call the Hyksos, which we're going to talk about, or another group of people called the Apiru, which we're going to talk about as well. So it's not clear from the story if you were to study all of the different histories, if the Israelites are actually the people that they're referring to in the story. Yeah, but I didn't want to ruin it. Sorry. Okay, we'll get there. We'll get there. So
Yeah, but that's really
it is very
So we
important.
went to all that trouble to save people who weren't even Israel.
Or maybe it wasn't even Israelites in the first place.
this is our story
Right.
that we
We
kind of
created
passed
as our
on.
story,
But what
right?
really happened isn't, something happened, but what?
Right. By the way, that's one of the big arguments you have, like from archaeologists like Lee Levine, as opposed to Richard Elliott Friedman or David Wolpe. Right? Did the Exodus even happen? So do people know who David Wolpe is? The big rabbi at Sinai Temple in LA. He gave a very politically inciting sermon because he basically got up several years ago and said that the Exodus didn't happen. And if the Exodus didn't happen, does it matter? And he argued that it doesn't matter because it's our story, right? And we made it our story. But if it didn't happen, then what on earth are we doing with this? And what does it come to teach us? And where did it come from? And all those things. And then, I haven't read it yet, but Richard Elliott Friedman wrote a new book called The Exodus. And it goes through saying, no, it did happen. It just happened on a different scale. But we'll go there. Yeah, Jerry.
So, one of the things that I've always found that hard to understand, and maybe the explanations, maybe these were not our people. And also the question is how much time actually transpired between their arrival in Egypt
Good question.
and their teaming and multiplying. If you start with 70 people, biologically, you can't be that many people after just a couple generations. So, question is, how many
No,
generations?
that's actually not true. That's not true. It's 34 to the power 8.
Yeah, the math works.
Right to the,
Doesn't matter.
Let's not go into the math so
Big
much
number.
yet, because the math is a little bit complicated, and I don't really want to try to argue that there were over 1 billion people who left Egypt, and we don't have any satellite imagery of it, but yeah, you're right, Jerry, there is a question about how much time evolves, and by the way, this is not the only pharaoh that's mentioned in the story. So there's actually another pharaoh that we're going to come to, who also, so we're actually getting further and further away from Joseph. And by the way, we know from the Abrahamic story, how long do they have to be enslaved for? 400 years. So it is conceivable, based on the Abrahamic narrative, that there was enough time that had elapsed where you would not have known previous people, in particular Joseph, and that we could have grown
But you're
sizably.
saying they were enslaved 400 years. The problem is that they were enslaved after they had multiplied.
no.
So the question is how
Not
long?
necessarily.
Well, they were enslaved because he multiplied. The reason they were enslaved is because they became a threat. That's why they were enslaved. They became a threat because they had multiplied.
Hold on,
Right.
where did the slavery begin?
It began after they were all a large group of people already there.
You could make the argument that slavery actually began with Joseph.
Yes.
Because what does Joseph actually do? What's his agrarian policy about?
He
Sam?
turns everybody into a serf.
That's exactly
Takes their
right.
land away, takes their money away, takes their stock. They just became tenant farmers, essentially.
But that's different than the Jewish slaves who were building pyramids.
You know what? I don't want to go into there's actually nowhere in the Torah that says the Jewish slaves built pyramids.
Right.
They build storehouses called Ramses and Pitom, but they don't actually build pyramids.
Yeah.
That's a different narrative that gets woven into this whole thing. But you can make the argument that the slavery has already started, and that slavery changes over time, right? Even if you just look at the next couple verses, look at verse 9. The new king has arisen. Vayomer el amo hine am b'nei Israel rav va'atzum mimenu. Look, they're so numerous, this people. And then the Pharaoh says, Hava nichakmalo pen yerbeh. Right? Let us deal shrewdly with them. Let's deal harshly with them, lest they continue to increase. Otherwise, in the event of a war, they may join our enemies and fight against us. You could argue that that's the beginning of a different kind of slavery. Right? That Joseph perhaps enslaved people in a different way, maybe not in the classical sense, maybe it was an indentured servitude kind of way. And now we're going to get even worse. And over time in the story, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Slavery takes on several forms. Did you have something you wanted to say before?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do here is read this separate from history. This
Correct,
is about
separate from
beliefs.
history. This is
This
just
about
the
beliefs.
text.
What is it that we believe?
Correct.
Let's just read it that way.
We're just trying to read the story to make sure we understand the story. We're going to layer in the politics. We're going to layer in the history. We're going to layer in what's going on in the north and the south. We're going to layer in Adonai and Yahweh and Elohim, and we're going to layer those things in, but I just want to make sure we understand the story. Okay, so look, Stan, will you read verse 11?
And they set commanders of work companies over it in order to degrade it with their burdens. And they built storage cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. And the more they degraded it, the more it increased, and the more it expanded. And they felt a disgust at the children of Israel.
Okay, keep going.
And Egypt made the children of Israel serve with harshness, and they made their lives bitter with hard work, with mortar and with bricks, and with all the work in the field. All their work that they did for them with harshness. Keep going?
No, let's stop there.
Yeah.
Okay, so they build these storehouses, they do other kinds of things. Just to give you a sense, look at verse 14 for a second. In the Hebrew, or in the English, it says that they ruthlessly made life bitter for them. In Hebrew, it says vayimareru et chayehem. They made their lives like maror.
Bitter, yeah, bitter.
Right? Vayimareru. Okay? If you look at yeah, I think that's enough for now. Okay, so we're going to start to see elements of the Passover story that will come out of this. And so each step of the way, they impose something on them, they get stronger, they get bigger. They impose more stuff on them, they get stronger, they get bigger. What was Egypt actually worried about according to this story?
The fifth column, they would take control.
Right, that they would take control. What did you say?
The fifth column.
The fifth column, right, okay. So that's the worry. There's nothing here about building pyramids. There is a lot here about trying to keep them in check, trying to keep the control. Now we have this weird aside story starting in verse 15.
Well, if the goal was to keep them in check, why wouldn't they just let them go?
Great question.
Because they didn't want to go.
They needed the labor.
So let's play it out for a second. If we let them go, what happens to the Israelites?
Take turn.
They could take charge. What else could they do?
Take revenge.
They could join other enemies and make a stronger army and attack. What else could they do?
Just go live someplace else.
They could go live somewhere else and leave them alone. That would be an option. If they keep them, what do the Egyptians get to do? Work them, control them, use them for whatever they want, help them make money, right? Even help them grow stronger. If they stay there long enough, they can actually get them to assimilate and become Egyptian. By the way, that happened with Joseph. It happens with the Greeks in the Hanukkah story. It happens a lot.
But don't we have a parallel with American slavery too? Why didn't they let
Sure.
slaves go?
Slavery
They were,
isn't
it was an
given a
economic
That's right.
incentive to keep them as slaves.
Absolutely.
Even though there were some states that had more black slaves than white citizens.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is where the story starts to change. We've just been given a backdrop in the Torah as to what's been going on, and now we're introduced to some characters. Stan, verse 15.
And the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the second was Puah, and he said, when you deliver the Hebrew women, and you look at the two stones, if it is a boy, then kill him, and if it is a girl, then she'll live. And the midwives feared God, and did not do what the king of Egypt had spoken to them, and they kept the children alive. And the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and kept the children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew aren't like the Egyptian women, because they're animals, before the midwife comes to them, they have given birth. And God was good to the midwives, and the people increased, and they became very powerful. And it was because the midwives feared God, and he made them households. And Pharaoh commanded all of his people, saying, every son who is born, you shall throw him into the Nile, and every daughter you shall keep alive.
Okay. We have these two women named Shiphrah and Puah. Okay? Let's argue for a moment. We know nothing else about them other than they are midwives, and their names are Shiphrah and Puah. What do we know about them based on the story? They fear God. And I want you to look in particular at the Hebrew. Verse 17. I'm on page 320. Vatir'ena hamiyaladot et ha'Elohim. They fear Elohim.
Right.
Okay? And what is it that they do? What are they charged with doing, and what is it that they do?
You're supposed to get rid of the boys.
They're supposed to get rid of the boys, and they don't do it.
They're too strong.
Well, I think that it's a different translation. Birth stool is another way of translating it.
Are those, the names of those women, are those Egyptian names?
Good question. So let's talk about these women for a second. I want you to take a look at verse, where is it? 15. In Hebrew, these women are called Meyaladot Ha'ivriot. Meyaladot is someone who raises a yeled. What's a yeled? A child. So we're going to call this a midwife. And what's an Ivri?
Hebrew.
A Hebrew. Could be Jewish. I want to shy away from using the word Jewish for a second because the word Jewish doesn't actually enter into our vocabulary until much later. If I wanted to say that someone was Jewish, what word would I use? That he is Yehudi, which comes from the Hebrew word Yehudah, who was Judah. Right, he was good, the southern kingdom, and Judah was the fourth child of Jacob. Right, it went Reuben, Levi, Shimon, and Judah. And Judah was number 4. Judah is also the hero of the Joseph story. Okay, but we're actually not called Judahites until we enter the land, and there's a section of the land that belongs to the tribe of Judah. We are called instead B'nai Yisrael. We are the, not children,
Sons.
the sons. Ben. Right? Now, yes, you could colloquially translate it as the children of Israel, but we're referring to the 12 sons. Okay? Me'eladot ha'ivriot could mean one of two things. The midwives of the Hebrews or the Hebrew midwives. What's the difference?
They're the same, well,
One they would be Hebrews and one they would be.
Good. One, they would be Hebrews, in which case they would be trying to kill their own people, or they would be Egyptian. And they just happen to be the midwives that serve for the Hebrews. And so we know about these women that they are God-fearing women, and we also know that Pharaoh says to them, kill the boys. But they come up with this ridiculous excuse. Well, it's too late by the time we get there, or whatever. And what does Pharaoh do in reaction?
He asks all the people to throw the babies.
He doesn't, but he doesn't do anything to them.
Right.
He kind of says, you know what? Well, do better. Work harder. Everyone should follow this decree. If they're Egyptian, it would make sense that he doesn't do anything to them, because they're his own people. But if they're Hebrews, why doesn't Pharaoh kill them? And then we have their names, Shiphrah and Puah. All right? The Midrashim and the Talmud, they like to say that Shiphrah and Puah were actually whom? Miriam and Yocheved. Who are Miriam and Yocheved? Moses' mother and Moses' sister. We're going to see why that is important in the next part of the story. And the next part of the story is going to be very interesting in terms of how it gets set up. But the rabbis want to say that these two women were actually, in fact, Hebrews. and that they're going to play a pivotal role in the future of the story. But one of the challenging things about the text in Hebrew, forget who wrote it for a moment, forget what political entity it came from, even the Hebrew is ambiguous. Are we talking about women who are Hebrews or women who are Egyptians? Are these women perpetuating the growth of the people? Or they just can't do anything about it because they're God-fearing?
If they're God-fearing, would they make them Hebrews?
Maybe.
I mean, the Egyptians weren't God-fearing.
Except that which God are we using? We're using God Elohim. And so we don't have yet a connection to Adonai. So it could be that they are worshiping the God of El, which was not an uncommon God to see in Egypt at the time. Phil?
It's interesting that, first off, that the two women are named, because
Yes.
women are rarely named in the Torah. And the second one is that they both end in AH.
Yes.
So there's some
Connection to an
Right.
right? To a Yahweh kind of thing. But yes, I didn't want to go there just yet, but you are correct. Okay, yeah.
This furthers the pejorative description of the Israelites, that the women aren't
Yes.
like the Egyptian women. They're more like animals. They're vigorous.
Yes.
They can give birth in the field.
Good. Good. Which, by the way, is going to impact the authorship. Or maybe the authorship impacts the way that you're reading it. If there's a particular MO that's trying to be portrayed here. Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. Any questions before we go to chapter 2?
Just one question. It said, the Pharaoh said, every son who is born you'll throw into the Nile.
Yep.
So is he saying that both to Egyptians and to Hebrews?
No, he's referring specifically to the Hebrew,
Oh, okay.
to the Hebrews, not to the Egyptians. No, the Egyptian sons were revered. Emily?
So he puts out this edict that should be done, and he's leaving it to each mother to throw her baby into the river. How successful was that?
No, we're not so successful. No, well, in particular, he's trying to get the midwives, who were the ones responsible for the birth happening, to intervene and essentially take over and kill the babies.
But what he said was everybody should be doing this.
Presumably, yes. That's the edict throughout the land that everyone should follow.
So why do you want to get rid of the Egyptian firstborn sons?
Who does? No.
I mean, why would I mean, if he's saying everybody, that means the Egyptians too.
And I meant every
No, I don't think he's referring to the Egyptians.
I meant every
Like all of his
He
people.
commanded all of his
His
people.
people would get rid of the Egyptians, the Hebrew.
I
His
think-
Freeman says that he's commanding all of his people.
He's commanding all of his people to
Verse
Get rid of the
22.
Hebrew boys.
Right.
Not to get rid of
It
the-
doesn't say Hebrew boys, but
No,
it
it
is.
just says every son is born.
Yeah, but I don't think it's referring to the Egyptian boys too.
I mean, that's
I think-
Freeman's translation.
It's Friedman's translation?
Yeah.
It says Egyptian?
No, it says every son.
Every son.
Yeah, that's what the text says. It
He's
says,
commanding all his-
"Vayitzav
he
paro
commanded
l'cholamo,
all his
lemor
people.
kol haben hayilod." Throw them in. But I don't think it's referring to the Egyptians.
But why is he saying he commanded all of his people?
Right, he's commanding all of the Egyptian people
Right.
to throw all of the Hebrew people.
It doesn't say Hebrew, it just says every
But
son.
it's an extension
implied.
of.
I think
what
it's an
he said
extension of the
before.
previous text that was just coming in with regard to the Hebrew boys.
Yeah, but the other text was written by a different author.
No, we're not looking at the authorship yet. I'm only looking at the text and the pshat and the simple, kind of easy way to, well, if it's easy, I'm not sure. The straightforward understanding of the text. The authorship plays a different level of understanding of what's going on here. And even the authorship isn't clear because it ping-pongs back and forth between different authors. So you have multiple narratives that are being strung together. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just another comment on the description of multiplying as like insects and then giving birth, they're like animals. This is typical of people who have slaves. They need to dehumanize them.
That is exactly right.
Or else, they hopefully can't live with them.
And by the way, you can make the argument that, correct, and you can make the argument that Shifra and Pua, what they're trying to do is restore some of the humanity in that process of dehumanization. Yeah,
So why were the daughters spared?
good question. Why are the daughters spared?
Because they can,
But why did they didn't want it?
And you can reproduce more with women than
Yeah,
with
they
men.
probably
It's not a reproductive thing.
they would go to war.
But the sons are more dangerous when they become men.
Because of what?
The sons are more dangerous once they become men.
That's correct. Right? By the way, I'm actually teaching a class to my high schoolers about the Holocaust, and we were learning about Hitler training Hitler Youth. Hitler does almost an identical thing with the boys and with the girls. The girls have classes in what it means to become a mother and to be able to procreate, and the men, it's all about becoming soldiers. And so there's a fear here, a militaristic fear of them becoming so powerful that the men will overtake them. Right? Remember, we still have fairly traditional, stereotypical gender roles in the Torah for now. But they will evolve in some ways, but in this text, it's pretty traditional. Okay, I want to look at chapter 2. Yeah?
This is how Moses became,
We're going to look at Moses right now.
that he was caught, he was in the river.
Well, that's why the rabbis want to translate Shifra and Puah as being Miriam and Yocheved. If they're the key midwives, then it makes a lot of sense how they orchestrate what's about to happen in the story.
But if Shifra and Puah are Hebrews, why would they refer to the Hebrew people as animals?
That's an easy. Yeah. They're trying to use the same language to play it off as Pharaoh, we're on your side.
You know,
Yeah, they're saying that I'm an animal.
Yeah, but
They are, according to the story. It doesn't make sense. Why?
Because you wouldn't do that.
Well, remember,
if
they,
you're trying
There
to
would be
fool
no
someone,
need to
you
do
would.
that.
He has
I
to
mean,
answer
people-
the Pharaoh.
People delivered in the fields all the time. That's what women did. I mean, they
That's
still
true.
do in primitive country. You deliver your baby, you continue on with your work.
right,
You know, that's what people did.
right.
So,
Now, I think that the tension that we have here, and I think that's why this phrase is ambiguous, is that we don't know who these women are and what their identities are. If they are Egyptian, right? If these women are the midwives of the Hebrews, it would make perfect sense for them to say that we're going to call all of the Hebrews that are in their presence scum of the earth, teeming insects, right? If they're Hebrew midwives, then they might want to do it as a way of trying to play along with Pharaoh so that they can stay in his good graces, because they actually are the heroes of the story. If they get into trouble and Pharaoh kills them, they can't serve as the ones who will cause the exodus. So it's a really tough balance, and the Hebrew is left intentionally vague because we don't know. The rabbis want to do all kinds of gymnastics to say, no, of course these are Hebrews, and of course they're doing whatever they can to stay as the connectors between Pharaoh and the people, but to do so in a way that will save their people. So it's a really tough balance to follow. And what we're going to see in the second story is what happens. Shifra and Puah, or these midwives, use their power to infiltrate Pharaoh's house. Okay, so let's take a look at chapter 2. Chapter 2, someone want to read? Bueller? Barbara, please.
And a man from the house of Levi went and took.
You know what, let's do it, sorry, 1 second. Let's all read from the same translation, because I think some people got confused. Let's all read from the Chumash, if you have it. Page 321. Because then this way you'll be less likely to look at the colors. Okay? Look at chapter 2, page 321, and then this way we can also look at the Hebrew too.
A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall her.
Okay, so let's talk about a family tree for a second. So we have Jacob, and Jacob has 2 wives. What are their names?
Leah and Rachel.
Leah and Rachel. Okay? Jacob and Rachel have 2 kids.
Joseph and Benjamin.
Okay? Jacob also has 2 maidservants, a maidservant that goes with each wife. Their names were Bilhah and Zilpah. Okay? With each of these 2 maidservants, he has 2 other children. So we've got 2, 4, 6, and then Leah has 6 children. But right now, the only one that I want to worry about are the top 4. Who was the firstborn?
Reuben.
Then?
Simeon.
No.
Simeon.
Yeah, Simeon.
No.
Levi.
That was Levi was second.
Yeah, then Simeon.
Then Simeon.
Okay.
And then Judah.
Judah.
Okay? Is that right?
Reuben, Simeon, Levi.
You're gonna make me
Yes,
check.
that's right, that's right,
That's right?
yes,
You got the order from there?
yes.
No, the order's reversed.
Reuben, Simeon.
Ribeye?
Reuben, Simeon,
Reuben,
Levi, and
Simeon,
Judah.
Levi, and Judah.
But Simeon is the second one, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, but they've got Benjamin in there and he was the last one.
All right, hold on.
These aren't in order.
They've got to be in there.
They're not in order because Benjamin was the youngest.
Hold on, hold on, hold
The
on.
beginning's in order. And
We
then
can go to the first chapter, I mean, the first, in the Genesis.
So Reuben, Simeon, Levi,
All
Judah.
right, who's gonna find it first?
I'm getting a little off.
I'm the only one looking?
They put a semicolon in there, so it must mean that they're beginning.
Yes, it's that.
Yeah, but she had 6 children, not 4.
No, this is right. This is Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Okay? These are the 4 children.
And then two come later.
Okay? I want to just look for a second about what we know of the history of them. Reuben, firstborn. What's his problem?
He sleeps with his father.
He sleeps with Bilhah. That's a no-no. Don't do that, please. All right?
Out.
What does Simeon do?
Simeon and Levi killed the men of Shechem.
Simeon and Levi kill all of the Shechemites after the assault of Dinah.
Right.
Okay, we're not exactly sure what happened to Dinah, but something not nice happened to Dinah, and the 2 of them come in and they kill everyone.
So,
I'm going to hold this one for a second.
Yeah.
Judah becomes the hero of our story, and he ends up doing what?
eating the.
He saves Joseph, he saves Benjamin, and ends up becoming the one who will become the heir to the southern kingdom. Levi is this weird in between. And Levi is going to end up holding a prominent place in our story going forward, because who does Levi become?
Just in a section of it, which is what was my question. Where do the priests come? Because it seems confusing when I'm reading the stories between the Levites and the priests.
Yep. So Levi is a tribe, and within the tribe there are children. And within the children, if you go down a couple of generations, you get to this guy who we have at the beginning of chapter 2, who, by the way, is unnamed. Okay, there's a certain guy who from the tribe of Levi. Does anyone know what his name is? What was Moses' dad's name? Amram. Okay, so Amram is married to Yocheved. Okay, and they have 3 kids. They have Aaron, they have Miriam,
And then Moses.
and then there's baby Moses. Everyone in the future is from the line of Aaron is going to be a Kohen. And everyone else is going to be a Levite. Why do you think that the Torah needs to tell us that this is a person who's being born from the house of Levi?
Probably
It was written by a
from-
Levite.
He's,
So maybe it was written by priests.
but they're promoting the tribe of Levi to be the northern kingdom, the priests of the northern kingdom.
Or maybe they're foreshadowing something that's going to happen connected to Levi. Remember, this is a story that's going to single out Moses from everybody else as someone who's going to rise to power. So
Golden calves.
yeah, we're going to get to the golden calf. We're going to spend a whole bunch of time on that as well. But for whatever reason, the Torah singles out a man from the tribe of Levi who has a child who happens to have a hidden identity. We don't know the child's name at this point. And they decide to hide the child for 3 months. Why? Because of the decree. And therefore, and thereafter, they put him in a basket and they float him down the Nile. By the way, who else happens to be involved in the story? His sister. We have these 2 unnamed women and an unnamed man who give birth to an unnamed child. Yeah.
Are we certain that this man is the father of both Aaron and Moses' sister? Because here it's saying that he came down and he married a daughter of Levi, and she got pregnant and gave birth to Moses.
Yeah.
Well, what happened to the 2 that came before Moses?
Great question. It's not in the text.
So how do we know he's the father of those 2?
It's a great question.
Maybe she was the mother with another man.
It's entirely possible. Right? And by the way, Jerry, you're asking a great question because the text doesn't tell us anything else about Moses' family. It only tells us that there was a man from the tribe of Levi who marries a Levite woman and they have a child. We have no idea how much time elapses between the first part of the verse and the next part of the verse. There's no indication in the text.
Can we talk politics a moment?
I would wait.
It sort of implies that that's their first child.
It could imply it, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that it's only the only
Somebody's got
possibility.
a sister.
Right, so then you get to the next part, which talks about the fact that verse 4 says, and his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall of him. So there must already be a sister in the picture.
Like, it could be a half-sister from another man.
Could be a half-sister, could be from another marriage, not clear, but there seems to be, by the way, there's no mention of another brother in the text. Only this guy, this baby, and the sister. And by the way, the sister's on lookout duty.
So it seems that because of the way it begins emphasizing Levites, that that's the purpose right here, is just to really emphasize that genealogy?
Yes, I think so. Right? Remember, the Torah chooses its words intentionally. So if it's going to call our attention to say that there's a tribe involved, let's pay attention to it. Before we got to the story, what tribe might you have thought would have been the focal point of the Exodus narrative? Which child of Jacob?
Joseph.
You would have thought it would be Joseph. Joseph was number 2 in command. But remember, we've been told in the story that there's a new Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph. And so now we have room for a new person or a new tribe to rise to power. It's important that we acknowledge this because the Levites are going to become the focal point of pretty much everything that's going to follow. And we're going to have to understand the relationship between God, Adonai, Yahweh, Elohim, whatever you want to call it, and the Levites. Yeah.
But from the end of Genesis, with the rise of Judah, I might have expected Judah to be the hero.
That's right. So what does that tell you about the story?
Someone else wrote it.
That's one possibility, Alvin, and I think that's a reasonable assertion. By the way, sorry I told you not to look at this, but if you look at chapter 2, it's a different author. Okay? So that's an excellent conclusion to draw. What else does it tell you about the story? That the author has different motives. Right? There's a different group of people that we want you to realize is going to come to power. You might have thought it was Joseph, but no, Joseph, we forgot about him. You might have thought it was Judah, but no, we actually want to turn your attention to somebody else. By the way, we're not going to forget about the Judahites because they're going to come back. Okay, let's just read a little bit more because I want you to experience what happens in Pharaoh's house. Barbara, you were reading verse 5.
The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy, crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water."
Okay. So Pharaoh's daughter comes down to the Nile. She's taking a bath, and while she's taking a bath, there's a basket that comes by, because that happens every time that we take a bath. Okay? And she spies the basket, and she sends over a slave girl to get it. Vatishlach et amata. An amma is a maid, could also be translated as a maidservant or as a female slave, to go and to get it. And they open it up, and inside there's a boy who's crying. She takes pity on it, and she says, "This must be mi yaldei ha'ivrim zeh." How does she know? He's circumcised. Now, does it say that anywhere in the Torah? No. Where in Jewish tradition do we know that they circumcise their sons?
Abraham.
Okay, that's fine, but where else do we know it?
From the Abrahamic.
That's true. We know it in the Passover story. In the Haggadah, it talks about the fact that even though they were told to kill their sons, they would still circumcise them before they would throw them into the Nile. But that's a rabbinic interpretation.
That's not the right interpretation because the Egyptians circumcised.
So then why would they say it?
Well, because he's ethnically different. You can tell he's Egyptian. He's darker. He's Hebrew, I mean.
He was wrapped in a blanket with Jewish stars on it.
The decree said that they should throw the Hebrew child into the water. They didn't say
All right, so
throw the
maybe,
Egyptian children into
good.
the
So
water.
Sandy, you're actually connecting the stories. You're saying throw the children into the Nile. Maybe they threw them into the Nile. It just so happened they threw them into a basket and he's still alive. They didn't follow exactly the letter of the law. And so maybe they realized that it was a Hebrew child.
They actually followed it to the letter of the law. They just threw it in the water. It didn't specify
How to throw them into the water. Okay, good. What were you going to say?
Oh,
Julie?
just what you said.
Oh.
Yeah.
The Nile was probably teeming with little.
It was a whole swimming party. There were babies everywhere. All right. We can argue about how we know that the child's Hebrew. What I actually want to discuss is who are the other women in the story. Okay, that's the question, and that's where we're going to stop.
Yeah.
So, who are the women? We've got 3 different mentions of women here. One is a slave girl. All right, that we have in verse 5, the Amata. Then we have verse 7. Verse 7 says, then his sister. Who's his sister?
Miriam.
Presumably it's Miriam, but it's the baby's sister. We don't have names yet for the children. All right, she just happens to be hanging around. Now, how do we know that?
It says that.
Because it said that she's stationed at a distance.
To keep an eye.
Right? She's keeping an eye out. So she sees Pharaoh's daughter.
She's following the basket.
She's following the basket.
Down the river.
So she goes up and says, can I get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child? And Pharaoh's daughter says yes. So she goes and calls the child's mother. How does she know that?
She knows the mother.
It's her mother. Or at the very least, if she's also a Hebrew maidservant, she knows the other Hebrews that are having babies, and she knows which one just threw it into a basket and threw it into the Nile. And what does she do? And Pharaoh's daughter says to her, take the child and nurse it for me and I'll pay your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it. You have just seen an infiltration of Moses' family into Pharaoh's house.
So she doesn't take the baby and nurse it. She goes into the palace and nurses it.
That's
No, it
Well, we
says
don't
she
know
takes
that.
it
No.
and she brought him to Pharaoh's
When
daughter
he
after
grows
he
up,
grew
when he
up.
grows up.
so there's an interesting debate about where the nursing takes place.
Okay.
Okay? One option is that the mom takes the baby home, nurses it, and brings it back when he gets up, when he's weaned in particular, or it happens in Pharaoh's house. But at the very least, it says that the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son, and she named him Moses. Now we could also make the argument of when does the naming happen? Does the naming happen when she draws him out of the water, or after he's weaned?
There's some importance to that in the sense
He's
that,
already circumcised.
as Moses grows, does he know where he really came from?
No. So that's an interesting question. You could make the argument that he doesn't know where he came from because he's growing up in an Egyptian household. At the same time, he's growing up with his mother and his sister right around him.
Right, but you don't know quite the ages and you
That's
don't know.
That's right.
Probably
Aren't you
nursed till
thinking
about
it's
5
like
in those
3?
days.
When she's taking him home to suckle him, I mean, it's just
Presumably.
getting past.
Presumably, and by the way, the next scene is what defines the answer to your question. Because he goes outside and he sees an Egyptian hitting or beating a Hebrew. And he reacts in a particular way and sees or feels some connectedness to this person because it's his people.
So,
Now, I just want to stay for one more second on these women. Do you think that there's any relationship between the women here in chapter 2 and the women of chapter 1? The midwives. You say no. Why?
Well, Miriam is supposedly a child, so she wouldn't be a midwife, or she would have been married and probably had children of her own,
Maybe.
you know,
Maybe.
at least a grown teenager.
Okay.
And the mother just had a baby, so why would she be midwife? You know, I mean, I guess she could be, but.
Right. Could be.
Probably watched too many detective stories, but this sounds like a scheme that they all together, developed to get into the Pharaoh's house.
Okay.
All the women, the midwives, everybody else had
They were all
to
in
be in on
cahoots.
it.
They had no way of knowing who was going to be there. I don't know.
Maybe.
Unless they knew that the Pharaoh's daughter came there every day,
Right,
she
yeah.
didn't have
Right.
a child.
By
she
the way,
wanted a
Good
notice
child.
the reaction between Pharaoh's daughter
Why
and the sister. It's not like, confrontational in any way. It's like they know each other. She goes and kind of makes this offer, and Pharaoh's daughter says, "Yeah, sure, that's a great idea."
But it says something about her being her slave girl. I mean, so that would kind of follow that, yes, she was following, but there was that connection already.
That's right. So it's possible that maybe Miriam was already in the household, and she was serving as essentially the slave girl to Pharaoh's daughter. What?
Or she was in cahoots with the slave girl.
Pharaoh's daughter was?
No, Miriam.
Miriam.
Because she was stationed,
Watching
and the
from
slave,
a
it sounds like she's separate than the slave girl.
Yeah,
and the
that's-
slave
You're
girl.
saying that
Watching
Miriam
from-
is not the slave girl?
Right.
Right.
Ah,
She's
But they
watching
could have
from a
known each
distance.
other. The
Huh?
slave would
She's
be,
watching from a distance.
could be. So now you're introducing another woman.
the slave would be a
Slave
slave
girl.
Okay?
By the way, you just said Miriam, but that name is absent.
Of course, Miriam is not nowhere mentioned here.
Yeah,
We don't
even
get
though,
Miriam
even though
mentioned.
they talk about the midwives' names.
They talk about with the midwives' names, but it's interesting that we have these different women who are either all the same women that appear in both stories, or they're actually all different women, but they're somehow working together. Or it's just a really interesting coincidence.
There are different things.
I don't understand why, presumably Pharaoh's daughter knew the decree.
Yeah.
And she recognizes from the features
Yep.
that it's a Hebrew child.
Mm-hmm.
Why say?
Great
Because she
question.
really wants a baby and she is
Right.
willing to take that one and she's in cahoots.
well, the
Could be.
note says she didn't agree with what the Pharaoh.
Wait, who said that?
This note says she
Oh, the
didn't-
note. Yeah, the
Something
note,
She
yeah.
didn't agree with.
I'm talking the text.
No, but it's a plausible, she
It is-
may
it
not
is
have agreed
plausible.
with what he.
Well, remember, you can make the argument also that Pharaoh's daughter has motherly instincts as well.
Just
She
like
sees a
just like-
child who is crying and she reaches out to,
And
right?
Moses was
It's-
beautiful.
Huh?
It says Moses was beautiful.
Right.
I mean,
He was
she's
a
got a
good-looking
great
kid.
cat. you
Well,
know,
and he was 3
Great
months old.
adoption.
He was in a Calvin Klein billboard just down by the Nile. Yeah.
The daughter of Pharaoh can do any damn thing she wants.
Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
Bill?
Something just occurred to me. I've been saying up until now, the first act of selfless kindness is Moses killing the overseer. Because nowhere else in Genesis do you find any selfless acts of kindness.
There's a couple.
Selfless acts? There's always some feedback. Some
I would make the argument that
feedback.
Rebecca, who were you gonna say?
What about Lot?
Yeah, Lot does it with regard to the messengers who come in and they're trying to be attacked by the Sodomites. You can make
But they
the argument
rescued him, is all I'm saying.
I know, but Rebecca
I'm not saying it
also
is-
similarly, the Torah uses the word chesed to talk about Rebecca's kindness toward Eliezer at the well. So there's a
And
couple.
I agree, but Maimonides, levels of mitzvot, and they did gain some benefit.
You're about a few millennia later.
I'm just saying, though, there was no benefit to Moses to killing the overseer. In
Right.
fact, he lost everything he had.
Right.
But really, I may have missed it because the princess is the first selfless act of kindness.
Could be.
Well, but she's gaining a
She's
child.
getting a baby.
That's true.
It's not selfless.
I'm a guy, I
Well,
missed
it
it,
implies
sorry.
sort of a greater plot in a sense, because number one, the sister is sort of tracking the basket, but the baby wasn't just thrown in the river.
Right.
He was thrown in the river, he was put in a basket,
Right.
sort of upriver from where the Pharaoh's daughter would be, who astoundingly
Expected.
discovers this
That's right.
beautiful
See, we
baby.
all agree.
It's all sort of this premeditated, formulated
Script.
Right.
activity, and that the sister was following to make sure that the baby didn't fall into the river.
Right. So one of the interesting things about the Exodus narrative is, where does it start? Does it start in chapter 1 or does it start in chapter 2, or does it actually start toward the end of chapter 2 and going into chapter 3? What we're going to look at next time is we're going to spend a few minutes on the very end of chapter 2, and then we're going to spend the bulk of our time on chapter 3 in the burning bush scene. Okay, and what happens when Moses meets God for the first time in reaction to running away, or after running away. Right? And then once we finish the burning bush scene, then we're going to go back and we're going to look at the politics of it and the authorship of it and who's interfacing with whom, and understand what other layers we can understand from the story. Okay?